He had buried 40 men and never flinched. He had burned down rival empires with a single phone call. He had walked into rooms that made hardened killers step aside. But on the morning Adrian Valenti woke up in a hospital bed and realized he could not feel his legs, the most feared man in the city pressed his face into a sterile pillow and made a sound he had not made since he was 12 years old. The crash had taken his body. The woman standing in the doorway with a patient file in her hands was about to take everything else. She had not recognized him yet. He had already recognized her. And after 15 years of silence, Adrian Valenti was not prepared for what her eyes were going to do to him. If this story already has your heart moving, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of this story to the very end, because what happens next will shake you in ways you did not expect. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one is going to stay with you. The accident happened on a Tuesday, which Adrian would later think was exactly the kind of ordinary day the universe chose when it wanted to remind you that nothing was permanent. He had been riding in the back of the black SUV the way he always did. Window up, phone in hand, Carver sitting in the front passenger seat running through the morning numbers without looking up. The Valenti organization moved money the way rivers moved water, constantly and without ceremony, and Adrian had long ago learned to read financial summaries the way other men read headlines. Automatic. Detached. He absorbed the numbers and stored them and said very little, and Carver had worked for him long enough to understand that silence was not disinterest, but simply the way Adrian Valenti processed the world. They were crossing the Meridian overpass at 6:40 in the morning when the truck hit them. No warning. No skid of tires, no horn, nothing. Just the sudden and total obliteration of the left side of the vehicle, a sound like the world splitting open along a seam nobody knew existed, and then Adrian was moving through space in a way that made no physical sense, weightless and then catastrophically not. And the city outside the window became a smear of gray sky and concrete and the brief, bright flash of morning light off the river below. He did not lose consciousness right away. That was the part he would not talk about later, the part his doctors would ask him to describe, and he would refuse. He remembered the silence after the impact with a precision that felt punishing. The SUV had come to rest on its side against the overpass railing. He could hear Carver making a sound somewhere in the wreckage. He tried to move and discovered that his legs were not responding the way legs were supposed to respond, and he lay in the broken glass and the spreading warmth of something he knew was blood, and he stared at the underside of what had been the passenger window, and he felt, with a cold and total clarity, that his life had just been divided into before and after. The surgery lasted 9 hours. When he woke, the first thing he saw was the ceiling of a private hospital suite. The second thing he saw was Marcus, his head of security, sitting in the chair beside the bed, with the expression of a man who had been rehearsing bad news for hours and still had not found the right version. "Carver," Adrian said. His voice came out wrong, thin. "He's alive," Marcus said. "2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist. They're keeping him for observation." Adrian nodded once and then looked at the ceiling again and said nothing for a long time. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind. "The doctors need to talk to you," Marcus finally said. "I know what the doctors are going to say." "Adrian, I said I know." He did know. He had known since he lay in the wreckage on the overpass and felt nothing below his waist. He had known through the surgery and through the first raw hours of coming out of anesthesia. The spinal cord injury was incomplete, which the neurosurgeon had explained meant the damage was severe, but not necessarily permanent. With aggressive rehabilitation, with commitment, with time, there was a real possibility of recovery. The doctor had used the word possibility with the practiced caution of a man who had delivered this speech many times, and understood that the word hope carried too much weight for certain patients. Adrian had listened to all of it and then asked the doctor to leave and stared at the ceiling for the remainder of the night. He was 34 years old. He had built the Valenti empire from the fractured remnants his father had left him, had expanded it and hardened it, and defended it against rivals who had come at him with everything they had. He controlled 6 commercial districts, owned 14 legitimate businesses used to move the organization's income, and commanded the loyalty of 312 people who would have walked into traffic if he told them to. He had survived 2 assassination attempts, a federal investigation, and the kind of slow psychological erosion that destroyed most men in his position before their 30th birthday. None of that had broken him. Lying in a hospital bed, unable to move his legs, was doing what none of it had managed. He refused most visitors. He refused the daily calls from the organization's attorneys and financial officers, routing them through Marcus with instructions that everything continue operating as normal and that nobody was to know the extent of his condition. He refused the rehabilitation consultations his team scheduled and canceled and rescheduled. He ate very little. He slept badly. He spent the long hours of the night staring at the window and feeling something he did not have a clean name for. Not grief, exactly, and not fear, though both were somewhere inside it. It was closer to the sensation of looking down and realizing the ground you had always stood on was simply gone. On the 11th day, a new name appeared on his patient chart. He found out the way he found out most things that happened in the hospital. Marcus obtained the rotation schedule from the floor nurse who had decided that doing small favors for the head of security was a reasonable trade for the sense that someone powerful was paying attention to her well-being. The name on the chart was Dr. Elena Whitmore, listed as the incoming lead rehabilitation specialist assigned to his case. Adrian read the name twice. Then he set the paper down on the bed beside him with the precise and deliberate care of a man trying not to react to something that was making the inside of his chest feel like a fault line. He told Marcus to leave. He sat with the name for a long time. Elena Whitmore. He had not spoken that name out loud in years. He had not let himself think it in years, which was a discipline he had cultivated the way he cultivated most disciplines, through repetition and force of will, through burying it deep enough that it stopped surfacing in the quiet moments. He had been largely successful. There were nights, early on, when it had been harder. When he was 19 and 20 and the organization was still raw and dangerous and everything required his total attention, he had sometimes caught himself in unguarded moments thinking about a girl with dark eyes who used to sit across from him at lunch and argue about things that did not matter and made everything feel like it mattered. He had learned to shut that down. He had gotten very good at shutting things down. He was apparently not as good at it as he thought. She walked in the next morning at 7:52. He knew it was her before she was fully through the door. He recognized the way she moved, the particular quality of self-possessed quiet she carried, and then she looked up from the tablet in her hands and she was both completely different and exactly the same, and Adrian felt something happen in his chest that he absolutely refused to examine. She looked at her chart. She looked at him. Something crossed her face in the half-second before her professional composure locked back into place, something complicated and fast that she controlled with a speed that told him she had been expecting this, or had at least been warned, or had figured it out before walking through the door. Her expression by the time she met his eyes was careful and neutral and entirely unreadable. "Mr. Valenti," she said, "I'm Dr. Whitmore. I'll be overseeing your rehabilitation program." Her voice was steady. Her posture was steady. Nothing about her gave away anything except the very faint tightening around her eyes that Adrian caught because he had spent 15 years learning to read people who did not want to be read. "Elena," he said. A pause. Short, controlled. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, "while we're in a clinical context, please." Adrian looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable and then looked away. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities did in the early morning, gray and indifferent and ongoing. He thought about the 11 days he had spent in this bed refusing to fight for his own legs. He thought about the way she had just walked in here and already put a wall up between them, and whether he had earned that wall or whether it had been built around something he still did not fully understand. "Fine," he said. "Dr. Whitmore." She moved through the initial assessment with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. She asked him about sensation levels, pain distribution, muscle response. She reviewed the surgical notes with a slight vertical crease between her brows that appeared whenever she found something she wanted to examine more closely. She spoke to him in the direct, information-dense way that good medical professionals used when they were treating patients rather than managing them. And Adrian, who had spent 2 weeks being managed, found himself paying attention despite everything. Your injury classification puts you in a category where meaningful recovery is genuinely possible, she said, not looking up from the tablet. But the window for optimal rehabilitation outcomes is time-sensitive. You've already lost 11 days. I'm aware. Are you? She looked up then. Because your chart shows 4 canceled consultation appointments and a documented refusal of the initial PT assessment. I had things to process. You have a spinal injury to recover from, she said. Processing is a luxury. Mobility is not. Something moved in his chest that was not anger, but was adjacent to it. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, had not been spoken to this way in years, and the fact that it was her doing it created a sensation he could not isolate into any single category. You're very direct, he said. I find it saves time. She closed the tablet cover. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Valenti. This kind of recovery requires the patient's full and active participation, not compliance. Participation. I've worked with patients who had more severe injuries than yours, who made full recoveries. I've also worked with patients who had less severe injuries and didn't. The difference was almost never about the injury itself. He watched her. What was it about? She looked at him directly, and for just a moment the professional distance thinned like ice over a current. Whether they decided they deserved to walk again. The room was very quiet after she said that. She left instructions with the nursing staff and told him the first session would begin at 8 the following morning. She did not ask if that worked for him. She was already at the door when he spoke. How long have you known I was the patient? She stopped. Her back was to him. The pause was 3 seconds, maybe 4. Long enough, she said, and walked out. He lay in the silence she left behind and stared at the ceiling and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific and disorienting sensation of being seen by someone who had already decided what they thought of him and was giving him nothing to work with. The first session the following morning was brutal in the way that necessary things often are. Elena did not coddle him. She explained each movement, its purpose, its target muscle group, its relationship to the larger recovery goal, and then she expected him to attempt it. When he couldn't, when his legs simply refused the signal his brain was sending, she did not offer sympathy. She noted it, adjusted the approach, and moved on. She was not cold, exactly. She was precise. There was a difference. Halfway through, with sweat on his face and his hands gripping the rail along the bed frame hard enough to whiten his knuckles, Adrian looked at her and said, "This isn't going to work." "Probably not today," she said. "That's not what I mean." "I know what you mean." She was adjusting the position of his right leg, her hands efficient and clinical. "And I'm not interested in having that conversation right now. We'll have it at the end of the session." "You don't work for me," he said. "You understand that, right?" She looked up at him then, something in her eyes that was not quite amusement, but was something in that neighborhood. "In this room," she said, "you work for me." He did not speak for the rest of the session. Neither did she, except to give instructions. But something had shifted in the air between them, some small and not entirely uncomfortable rearrangement of the terms, and Adrian noticed it the way he noticed everything that mattered, quietly, without showing it, and without forgetting it. It was on the 4th day that the control began to slip. He had been doing better than he expected. The sessions were punishing, and the nights after them were long and filled with the particular exhaustion that comes from asking a damaged body to remember what it once knew. But there were signs. Small ones. A sensation in his left thigh that had not been there before. A muscle response in the lower right leg that Elena noted without expression and logged in the chart with careful precision. Adrian had learned to read her chart notations the way he read financial reports, looking for the information beneath the information, and he could see, in the spare clinical language, that she was cautiously encouraged. He was watching her write when he made the mistake of letting his guard down for the first time in 4 days. "You never wrote back," he said. She stopped writing. "I sent you 7 letters," he said. "After you left. 7. The last one was almost 2 years after you disappeared. But—" He heard his own voice and recognized something in it that he usually kept under several layers of containment. "You never responded to a single one." Elena set down the pen, very carefully. The kind of care that meant the alternative would have been to throw it. "Adrian, I'm not asking you to explain yourself, he said. I'm just telling you what happened, from where I was standing, in case you forgot. I didn't forget. Her voice had changed. Something underneath the professional surface was moving. I didn't forget any of it. Then why? We should not be having this conversation, she said. Not here. Not like this. When then? You walk in and out of this room twice a day, and you're very good at being a doctor. You're excellent at it, but you look at me like I'm a stranger, and I'm trying very hard to function like a normal human patient, and I am not built for that. The silence between them had weight. What you're feeling right now, she said finally, and her voice was controlled in the way voices got when control was the only alternative to something much more difficult, is a normal part of the emotional processing that comes with traumatic injury. It's common to redirect. Don't, he said. She stopped. Don't do that, he said quietly. Don't turn this into a symptom. Elena Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen. Then she put it back down. Then she said very quietly, I think it would be better for your recovery if I transferred your case to Dr. Reeves. The words landed with a flatness that Adrian recognized as the sound of something closing. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Fine, he said finally. Transfer the case. She nodded once. She collected her materials. She walked to the door and he watched her go and thought about how this was the second time in his life he was watching Elena Whitmore walk away from him, and how the first time had destroyed something in him that had taken years to grow over, and how this time he was a 34-year-old man with a spinal injury and an empire to run and absolutely no business feeling the particular hollowness currently expanding in the center of his chest. She was at the door. Elena. She stopped. She did not turn around. I just want to understand what happened, he said. That's all. Not an apology. Not anything from you that you don't want to give. Just 15 minutes. The truth about why you left. He paused. After that, I'll never bring it up again. You can transfer the case or keep it, whatever you want. But I need 15 minutes. The door was open. She was standing in the threshold with the morning light from the corridor behind her, and her hand on the door frame and her back to him. And Adrian Valenti, who had not needed anything from anyone in a very long time, waited. She did not answer. She walked out. And Adrian stared at the empty doorway and thought about the 7 letters he had written as a teenager to a girl who had vanished, and about the silence that had come back instead, and about how some distances were too wide to cross, no matter how many years of discipline and forced forgetting you stacked against them. What he did not know yet, what he could not possibly know, lying in that hospital bed watching the empty threshold, was that Elena Whitmore had gone directly to the women's restroom 2 doors down the corridor, locked herself in the furthest stall, pressed her back against the cold tile wall, and was standing very still with her eyes closed and her hands flat against her thighs, breathing through something that had been building in her chest since the moment she first saw his name on the patient assignment list, and that she had not responded to a single one of his 7 letters because she had never received them. The transfer paperwork sat on Dr. Reeves's desk for 36 hours before anyone signed it. Elena had submitted it the same afternoon she walked out of Adrian's room. She had filled in every field with the kind of mechanical efficiency that meant she was not thinking about what she was doing, only doing it, moving through the administrative motions because movement was the only alternative to standing still, and standing still was not something she could afford right now. She handed it to the floor coordinator, went back to her office, closed the door, and sat at her desk for 11 minutes without opening a single file. Then she opened her files and worked until 9 o'clock at night and did not think about Adrian Valenti. She was very good at not thinking about things. She had been practicing since she was 17 years old. Dr. Reeves was a competent rehabilitation specialist, thorough and patient, well regarded by the nursing staff. He went to room 412 the following morning with the chart and introduced himself and explained that he would be taking over the program from this point forward. He got 3 sentences in before Adrian looked at him with the particular quality of stillness that the people who worked for Adrian Valenti had learned over the years meant something was about to become very difficult. No, Adrian said. Reeves blinked. Mr. Valenti, Dr. Whitmore has... I heard what Dr. Whitmore did. I'm telling you, I don't want another doctor. The transfer has already been processed. Unprocess it. Reeves stood in the middle of the room, holding the chart and looking at the man in the hospital bed with the expression of someone who had just realized the conversation he thought he was having was not the conversation that was actually happening. He was a good doctor. He was not equipped for this particular patient. He went back to the floor coordinator. The floor coordinator went to the department head. The department head called Elena. She was in the middle of a session with another patient when her pager went off. She excused herself, stepped into the corridor, read the message, and stood very still for a moment with the pager in her hand and the corridor noise moving around her like water around a stone. She called the department head back from the nurse's station. "He's refusing the transfer," Dr. Calloway said. He was 62 years old and had the voice of a man who had navigated 30 years of hospital administration and found very little of it surprising anymore. He's also apparently told Reeves, and I'm quoting the nursing notes here, that the next person who walks through his door with paperwork can keep it. He doesn't have the authority to refuse a physician reassignment. "Elena," Calloway's voice was not unkind. "He has the kind of authority that comes with owning the building we're currently standing in." She closed her eyes briefly. "He doesn't own. His organization made a substantial contribution to the new rehabilitation wing 3 years ago. I'm not saying it gives him medical decision-making power. I'm saying that when a man like Adrian Valenti decides he doesn't want something, the path of least resistance is generally to find out what he does want." A pause. "He's asking for you specifically." "I'm aware of what he's asking for. Is there a personal history I should know about?" "No," she said, which was the most efficient answer and also the most incomplete one she had given anyone in years. "I'll handle it." She did not go to his room immediately. She finished her session, wrote her notes, ate half a sandwich standing at her office window looking at the parking structure across the street, and then she went to room 412 at 2:17 in the afternoon and opened the door without knocking. Adrian was sitting up in bed. He had the financial newspaper open across his lap, but he was not reading it. He looked up when she came in and said nothing. She closed the door behind her. She did not sit down. "I'm going to be very clear with you," she said. "This is not a negotiation, and it is not a conversation. You're a patient in a medical facility, and you do not get to dictate the composition of your care team." "I'm not dictating anything," he said. "I'm expressing a preference." "Your preference is disrupting the entire department." "My preference is to have the doctor who actually knows what she's doing." He set the newspaper aside. "Reeves is fine. He's probably very good. But you've already assessed me, you know my chart, and I don't want to start over." "That's not the real reason." "No," he said, "it's not." The honesty of it stopped her for a half second. She had been prepared for deflection, for the kind of tactical reframing she had already seen him use in their sessions. The directness was harder to work with. "Adrian, I'm not trying to make this complicated," he said. "I told you what I want. 15 minutes. You give me that, and I'll sign whatever papers Reeves needs, and I will be the most cooperative patient on this floor. And if I don't?" He looked at her steadily. "Then I'll keep refusing every doctor you send, and we'll all spend a lot of time being professionally miserable together." She studied him. He was thinner than she had expected when she first walked into this room 2 weeks ago. Not dramatically, but enough that she could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight hollowing at his temples. He had not been sleeping well. She could see that too, in the particular quality of tiredness that lived behind his eyes, the kind that sleep debt alone could not explain. He had been a boy once who looked exactly like this, tired in a way that had nothing to do with rest. 15 minutes, she said. "Not in this room." He blinked. She had surprised him. "There's a small family consultation room at the end of the corridor," she said. "I'll arrange for a wheelchair transport. 15 minutes, and then we come back here and you sign the transfer and we're done. And if I want to keep you as my doctor after 15 minutes, then we'll have a different conversation." She moved to the door. "I'll be back at 4. She was back at 4. The consultation room was small and beige and smelled like industrial cleaner and the faint ghost of old coffee. There was a round table with 4 chairs and a window that looked out at the hospital's interior courtyard, where someone had planted a small garden that nobody seemed to tend particularly well. Elena sat across from him with her hands folded on the table and waited while the transport aide closed the door behind him. The silence between them was different in here. In the hospital room, there was always the structure of the clinical context to organize around. The chart, the assessments, the professional roles that kept everything in its correct position. In here, there was just the table and the bad lighting and 15 years of unresolved distance. "You said you sent 7 letters," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. Where did you send them?" A pause. "The address you gave me, the Whitmore house on Carver Street, and then after that was empty, your aunt's address in Portland, and then the school district office, because I didn't know what else to do." He said it flatly, like he was reading from a list, like he had rehearsed being detached from this for long enough that the detachment had become structural. "The last 2 I sent to your father's work address, the engineering firm." Elena was very still. "I got nothing back," he said. "Not a returned letter, not a message through anyone, nothing. And after a while I decided that meant you had made your choice, and I was going to respect it, even if I didn't understand it." She looked at the table. "I didn't get them," she said. "I know that's what you'd—" He stopped. Something had shifted in her face, and it was not the kind of shift people manufactured. He had spent 15 years reading people for survival, and he knew the difference between a constructed response and a real one. "What do you mean you didn't get them?" "I mean I didn't get them." She looked up. Her eyes were steady and very dark, and something in them was doing the same thing he had felt in his chest when he first read her name on the chart, something old and banked and not entirely safe. "Adrian, I didn't leave because I wanted to." The room was very quiet. "My father received a diagnosis in the fall of that year," she said. "Cardiac. It was serious, and it happened fast, and we had to move immediately to be closer to his treatment center. I didn't have time to— There was no time for any of the things I should have done before we left." She paused. "I wrote to you 3 times in the first month. I wrote to the house and to the school, and I wrote to your father's office because it was the only address I could find for the family." Adrian's jaw had gone tight. Something was moving in him that he was keeping very controlled. "Victor Valenti's office," he said. "Yes." The name sat between them like something with weight. "I got a letter back from his secretary," Elena said. "Formal, very polite. It said that Adrian Valenti was focusing on family responsibilities and would not be maintaining personal correspondence." She met his eyes. "I thought you had moved on. I thought—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I was 17, and I was in a city I didn't know watching my father recover from surgery, and I thought you had decided I wasn't worth the trouble." Adrian said nothing for a long time. Outside the window, a sparrow landed on the edge of the untended garden and pecked at something in the dirt and flew away. "My father," Adrian said. His voice was completely flat, the kind of flat that was not calm but was the surface over something very deep and very hot. "My father's secretary responded to your letters." "Yes." "And my letters to you." "I never received them." The implications of that settled into the room like sediment dropping through water, slow and irreversible, and changing everything about the landscape at the bottom. Victor Valenti had been dead for 4 years. He had died of a stroke at 67, still running the organization, still controlling everything within his considerable reach, still moving the pieces of other people's lives around a board that only he could fully see. Adrian had inherited the empire and expanded it, and in 4 years of running it had found dozens of decisions his father had made that he disagreed with, some that disturbed him, a few that had required significant effort to quietly undo. He had not known about this one. He sat in the wheelchair in the beige consultation room and felt something that was not grief and was not rage, but contained elements of both, a specific and suffocating understanding of how much had been lost and who had decided it should be lost and why. And the why was the worst part because he could hear his father's voice in it as clearly as if Victor were sitting in one of the empty chairs. "Adrian has responsibilities. The girl is a distraction. She comes from nothing that matters. He has to be hard. Hard." His father's favorite word. His father's only real value. The thing Victor Valenti had spent Adrian's entire childhood trying to build him into, sanding away everything that was soft or uncertain or human, because in Victor's world, softness was a liability and liabilities got you killed. Adrian. Elena's voice was careful. He realized he had not spoken in some time. How long were you sick? He said. A pause. What? You said you moved to be closer to your father's treatment center. He looked at her. But that's not everything, is it? She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at the table. No. Tell me. That isn't relevant to that, Elena. His voice was quiet. Not threatening, just certain. Tell me. She was quiet for what felt like a full minute. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of something that had been carried a long distance and set down carefully. The year after we moved, I started getting tired in ways I couldn't account for, bruising easily. Low-grade fevers that wouldn't resolve. She stopped, looked at the window. They diagnosed me with leukemia when I was 18, acute lymphoblastic. I did 2 years of treatment. The word landed in the room and changed the air. You were 18, he said. Yes. You were going through that and you thought I had... He stopped. Something in his throat had tightened in a way that was making it difficult to maintain the flat and measured tone he had been using. You thought I had just stopped caring. I was 18 and I had cancer. And I didn't have the energy to chase after someone who had apparently moved on. There was no accusation in her voice. That was almost worse. I just had to get through each day. That was all I could do. Adrian sat with that. He thought about the year he was 18. He had just taken over the organization after his father's first non-fatal health scare. He had been running on no sleep and total adrenaline, fighting to establish his authority over men who were twice his age and twice as dangerous. And in the spaces between all of that, he had been writing letters to a girl who he believed had chosen to forget him. He had been angry, and he had been lonely, and he had channeled both of those things into becoming exactly the kind of man his father had always wanted him to be. Because there was nothing else to channel them into. Because she was gone. Because Victor Valenti had made sure she was gone. Okay, he said. Elena looked at him. Okay? I need you to keep my case. She blinked. Adrian, we agreed. I know what we agreed. He looked at her directly. I'm asking you to change the agreement. Not because of this. Not because of any of what we just talked about. He paused. Because you're a good doctor and I need to walk again. And right now you're the only person in this building who has actually made me want to try. She studied him. He let her study him. He had nothing to hide in this room right now, which was a strange sensation for a man who had built an entire identity around concealment. This stays professional, she said finally. Yes. What we discussed today doesn't come into the sessions. Agreed. And if at any point it becomes clear that the personal history is affecting the clinical outcomes, I transfer the case without argument. Fine. She nodded once. She stood up. She pushed her chair in with both hands and straightened her coat and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had just agreed to something she was not certain was wise and had decided to do it anyway because the alternative was worse. I'll see you at 8 tomorrow morning. She went to the door. Her hand was on the handle. Elena. She stopped. I'm sorry, he said, for the things I said in the room that first week, the things I accused you of. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't know. No, he said, but I should have considered the possibility that there was a reason. She didn't answer that. She opened the door and walked out, and Adrian sat in the small beige room and looked at the untended garden through the window and thought about his father, and about 7 letters that had gone into a machine and come out as silence, and about a girl who had been 18 years old and sick and alone and had believed he had abandoned her. The rehabilitation sessions changed after that day. Not in their structure. Elena maintained the same clinical precision, the same demanding approach, the same refusal to offer comfort where effort was required. But something underneath the structure had shifted, the way ground shifts after a long rain, not visibly altered but fundamentally different in its composition. Adrian worked harder, not because she pushed him harder, but because something that had been locked in him for 2 weeks had come loose, and he found that anger, the clean, focused, outward-directed kind, was surprisingly effective fuel for physical recovery. He was angry at his father. He used it. By the end of the third week after their conversation in the consultation room, he had sensation throughout both legs. By the end of the fourth week, he was beginning the work of weight-bearing exercises, standing at the parallel bars with his hands white-knuckled on the rails and his jaw set, and sweat running into his collar while Elena stood 3 feet away and watched with the careful attention of someone reading a very fine-print document. "Again," she said, "I've done it 12 times. 13 is better than 12. He did it 13 times. His legs were shaking by the end. He did not say anything about that. Marcus reported to him at the end of each week, updates on the organization's operations, the business that continued moving while he was stationary. A territorial dispute in the East District had been handled by Carver, who was back on his feet and apparently more than capable in Adrian's absence. The federal attorneys had sent another round of routine inquiries that the organization's legal team had routed through the standard process. Everything was, as Marcus put it, holding. What Marcus did not report on, because he understood which details Adrian did and did not want formalized, was the way the men talked. 3 weeks without Adrian Valenti visible and present was the kind of absence that bred speculation in organizations like theirs. Speculation bred anxiety. Anxiety bred the kind of opportunistic calculation that was dangerous in men who had spent their careers in proximity to power and had begun to wonder what it might feel like to be closer to the center of it. Adrian was aware of this. He was not yet in a position to do much about it. On a Thursday evening in the 5th week, Marcus came to the room with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression that meant what he was about to say was not routine. "Gianni made a move," Marcus said. Gianni Ferraro, the head of the Ferraro operation, which controlled the southern port districts and had spent the past 3 years existing in careful and mutually profitable tension with the Valenti organization. It was the kind of relationship that required constant maintenance, like a fire that needed tending to stay useful rather than destructive. "What kind of move?" Adrian said. "He had a meeting with the Lorne Street distributors. Our distributors. Didn't invite us." The room was quiet for a moment. "Who authorized the meeting?" "Nobody on our side. He went around us entirely." Adrian looked at the window. Outside, the city was going dark in the early evening, lights coming on in the buildings across the way, the ordinary, ongoing machinery of a world that did not particularly care whether he could walk. "Set up a call," he said. "Tomorrow morning." "You sure you want to handle this from here?" "Marcus?" He looked at him. "Set up the call." Marcus left. Adrian sat in the near dark for a while, thinking about Gianni Ferraro and what a meeting with the Lorne Street distributors meant, and what it was going to require to make the point that needed to be made. He was thinking about this with the specific and practiced clarity of a man who had been doing this kind of thinking for 15 years when the door opened without a knock. Elena came in carrying a tablet and a small cooler bag, and stopped when she saw him sitting alone in the low light. "I forgot my—" She looked at him. "Are you all right?" "Fine." She looked at him for another moment with the attention of someone who had developed over the past several weeks a very accurate sense of when that word meant what it said and when it meant something else entirely. Then she crossed to her equipment cart, retrieved whatever she had come back for, and was almost at the door again when she stopped. "Your blood pressure was elevated at the end of today's session," she said, not turning around, "more than the exertion accounts for. If something is adding to your stress load right now, you need to tell me." "There's nothing to tell." "Adrian." "It's handled." She turned around. She looked at him across the room with her coat on, and the tablet under her arm, and the expression of a woman measuring something. "The kind of men who come to see Marcus at this hour," she said carefully, "generally aren't bringing good news." He was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that." "I'm observant. It's part of the job." She paused. "Whatever is happening out there, if it's going to affect what happens in here, I need to know." "It won't. You don't know that." "Elena." He said her name the way he had always said it, without calculation, just the word as the word. "I have managed both of these things my entire adult life. I can manage them now." She looked at him for a long time. Something was moving in her expression that she was not entirely successful at controlling, Something complicated that had to do with more than his blood pressure reading. Then she nodded. Then she left. Adrian sat in the dark for another hour, working through the Ferraro situation, mapping the response, thinking about leverage and timing and the specific language Gianni would respond to. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. It was almost a comfort, how automatic it was, how cleanly his mind moved through these problems. He was thinking about all of this when his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. It was not about Ferraro. It was 3 words, "Call me now." Adrian called. Marcus picked up on the first ring. There was something wrong in his voice, a quality of contained urgency that Adrian recognized from the handful of genuinely serious moments in 15 years of working together. "One of my people intercepted a communication from inside the hospital," Marcus said. "Someone has been reporting your status to an outside party, your condition, your mobility levels, your projected recovery timeline." The room was very cold all of a sudden. "Who is the outside party?" Adrian said. A pause. "We're still tracing it, but Adrian—" Another pause, shorter. "The communication referenced Dr. Whitmore by name." Adrian held the phone and did not speak for a full 10 seconds. "It said she was the key point of access," Marcus said. "And somewhere down the corridor, Elena Whitmore was walking toward the parking garage with her coat on and her tablet under her arm, completely unaware that someone had just made her the most dangerous person in Adrian Valenti's orbit." Adrian was on the phone with Marcus for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. He knew the duration because he was watching the clock on the wall across from his bed the entire time. The way he watched things when his mind was moving very fast and needed something fixed and external to anchor against. 4 minutes and 20 seconds to absorb the information, ask the necessary questions, and give the first set of instructions. Then he ended the call and set the phone on the bed beside him and sat very still in the low light of the room. Someone inside this hospital was feeding information about him to an outside party. His condition, his mobility levels, his recovery timeline, and Elena Whitmore had been named in the communication as the key point of access. He ran through what that could mean with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years in a world where ambiguity about people's intentions was a luxury you could not afford. It could mean Elena was the source, that she was knowingly passing his medical information to someone who wanted it. It could mean someone was using her without her knowledge, intercepting her communications or monitoring her movements. It could mean she had been placed in his case deliberately by someone who had anticipated his resistance to other doctors and arranged for her to be the one assigned to him. He sat with all 3 possibilities for a long time. The problem was that none of them felt clean. He called Marcus back at 11:15. "I need everything on Elena Whitmore," he said. "Not the surface file. Everything. Who she's been in contact with since joining this hospital. Her financial records. Anyone who's been asking about her in the past 6 months. That's going to take time. Then start now." He did not sleep. At 2 in the morning, he was still awake, sitting upright in the bed, with the city lights coming through the window and the room around him silent, except for the machinery that monitored things and beeped softly at intervals that had long since stopped registering. He was thinking about Elena in the parking garage, walking to her car, completely unaware. He was thinking about the way she had looked at him an hour ago and said, "Whatever is happening out there, I need to know." He was thinking about the shape of her face when she said it, and the quality of the concern in her voice, and whether any of that had been real or whether he was exactly the thing his enemies had always said he was. A man who confused wanting to trust someone with having a reason to. He had been wrong about people before. Not often, but enough. Each time had cost him something he could not recover. He was not willing to be wrong about Elena. He was also not willing to assume he was right. At 6:30 in the morning, Marcus came back with the first layer of what his people had been able to pull overnight. He sat in the chair beside the bed with a single sheet of paper. They did not write things down as a practice, but certain information needed to be reviewed physically and then destroyed, and walked Adrian through it in a low voice. Elena Whitmore's finances were ordinary: hospital salary, student loan payments, a modest savings account, no anomalous deposits, no unexplained transactions. Her phone records showed contact with colleagues, her father Richard Whitmore in Portland, and a small cluster of personal numbers that had been active for years, The pattern of a person with a stable and small social circle. What about the communication that referenced her by name? Adrian said. Where did it originate? That's the part that's more complicated. Marcus looked at the paper. It came from inside the hospital system. Email account tied to a staff ID, but the staff ID belongs to a facilities technician who doesn't appear to have sent it. Spoofed, most likely. Whoever sent it knows the hospital's internal systems well enough to use a legitimate account as cover. Adrian processed this. So it's not necessarily someone on the medical staff. Could be anyone with administrative access, which in a building this size is a significant number of people. But they named her specifically. Yes. Which means they know enough about my case to know who's treating me and how she fits into my access points. Adrian looked at the window. That's not casual knowledge. That's someone who's been watching. Marcus nodded. Is she in danger? Marcus was quiet for a moment. The communication read more like surveillance reporting than target identification. Whoever sent it was telling someone about her, not asking for something to happen to her. He paused. But that could change. Adrian sat with that. I want someone on her, he said. Discreet. She doesn't know. And I want the Ferraro situation re-examined. Find out if there's any connection between Gianni's meeting with the Lorne Street people and whoever is watching this hospital. Marcus left. Adrian had 40 minutes before Elena's session began. He used them to think about how to handle the next hour without letting her know what he knew. Because if she was innocent, and everything Marcus had found suggested she was, then telling her would terrify her, and he was not in a position to protect her the way he needed to while lying in this bed. And if she was not innocent, then showing his hand before he had more information was exactly the kind of mistake that got people killed. He had made his career on patience. He would be patient. She came in at 8 exactly. She was carrying her tablet and her coffee, and she looked like someone who had gotten slightly more sleep than he had, which was not a high bar. She went through the preliminary check with her usual efficiency, taking his blood pressure and reviewing the overnight nursing notes, and Adrian watched her with the particular quality of attention he had spent 15 years developing, the kind that registered everything and showed nothing. Your resting heart rate is up, she said, not looking at him. I didn't sleep well. Any pain? No. She looked at him then. Her eyes moved over his face with the practiced assessment of a clinician, and also, underneath that, something else. Something that was not clinical, but that she kept carefully behind the clinical so that it was only visible if you were looking for it. Adrian was looking for it. He did not know what to do with what he found there. You're holding something, she said. He kept his face completely neutral. I'm sitting in a hospital bed. Adrian, she set the tablet down. I've been doing this for 8 years. I can tell when a patient is managing me versus talking to me. Whatever happened last night with Marcus is handled, he said. The same words as the night before, delivered the same way. She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not hurt exactly, but the kind of careful closing that happened when someone who had been extending trust pulled it back slightly, recalibrating. She picked up the tablet. Let's work, she said. They worked. Adrian threw himself into the session with more focused aggression than usual, using the physical effort to manage the thing that was running underneath his thoughts like a current. Elena noticed. She adjusted. She pushed the session harder to meet what he was giving, which was exactly what he needed, and also, for reasons he did not examine, exactly what infuriated him about her. She was always right about what he needed. At the end of the session, when he was at the parallel bars with his hands on the rails and his legs doing the work they were slowly, incrementally relearning how to do, she came to stand at the end of the bars, not in front of him, beside him. Close enough that he was aware of her the way he had always been aware of her, in the specific and inconvenient way that had nothing to do with injury or recovery. 7 more steps, she said. I've done 20 today. 7 more. He did 7 more. By 10 in the morning, he was back in the bed and she was writing her notes, and he was watching her write and hating everything about the situation he was in. The bed, the legs that still were not where they needed to be, the organization that was being tested in his absence, and most of all, the woman sitting 6 feet away from him who might be exactly what she seemed and might be something else entirely, and he did not have enough information yet to know which. Elena. He said it without planning to. She looked up. The night you were diagnosed, he said. The first time. Were you alone? She was still for a moment. My parents were with me, but in the room at the moment. A pause. Yes. The doctor came in and my parents had stepped out for coffee. She looked at him steadily. Why? I'm trying to understand what those years were like, he said. For you. She set the pen down. She looked at him the way she sometimes did in the consultation room, with the distance pulled back slightly so that the person underneath the professional was closer to the surface. It was very quiet, she said finally. That's what I remember most. How quiet everything became. Like the world was still happening, but behind glass. He nodded slowly. Adrian. Her voice had changed. Careful now. What's going on with you? Nothing. That's the third time you've said that word in 16 hours. Elena, you're different today. She was watching him with the focus he had seen her use when she found something in a chart that did not match. Not in a clinical way. She stopped, looked at him. Did something happen involving me? The question sat between them. He looked at her face and thought about the 17-year-old girl who had written 3 letters to a boy who never received them and had been answered by a cold secretary's note and had then spent the next 2 years fighting for her life alone. He thought about everything she had survived and whether it was fair to add this to it before he had more information. He thought about the 7 steps she had just made him take at the end of the session when he was already exhausted, because she understood instinctively that the last 7 were the ones that mattered. No, he said. Get some rest. I'll see you tomorrow. She looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then she collected her things and left. At 2 in the afternoon, Marcus called. The Ferraro connection was real. Marcus laid it out in the low, precise voice he used when the information was both important and dangerous. Johnny Ferraro had not simply met with the Lorne Street distributors. He had been building a relationship with them for months, quiet and gradual, the kind of cultivation that only became visible when you looked at the full timeline rather than any individual meeting. And the individual who had been brokering those meetings, the connector, the person who had introduced Ferraro to the right people and smoothed the early conversations, was a man named Daniel Chu. Adrian knew the name. Daniel Chu was a mid-level operations manager who had been with the Valenti organization for 6 years. He was careful and competent, and had never given anyone a reason to look at him twice. How deep does Chu go? Adrian said. Deep enough, Marcus said. He's also the one we think sent the hospital communication. His access level would give him the technical knowledge to spoof the staff account. He's been feeding Ferraro information about my condition. About your condition, your recovery timeline. Who has access to you in the hospital? He's been building a picture of how incapacitated you are and sharing it with Gianni. So Johnny knows I'm not walking yet. Yes. And the meeting with Lorne Street is Gianni preparing to move while he thinks I can't respond. That's how it looks. Adrian closed his eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all he allowed. Then he opened them and looked at the city through the window and thought about Daniel Chu, who had sat in his conference room for 6 years and eaten meals with his people and taken his money, and thought about Gianni Ferraro, who had spent 3 years performing the theater of mutual cooperation while apparently waiting for a moment of weakness. The moment of weakness being now. The moment of weakness being him, in this bed, with his useless legs and his medical chart and Elena Whitmore's name circled in a surveillance communication. What is Chu's relationship to Elena? He said. Silence on the other end. Marcus. That's the part I needed to tell you in person, Marcus said. Are you? Tell me now. A pause. Chu's sister is a hospital administrator here, 3rd floor. She's the one who processed the physician assignment changes on your case. Another pause. Including the initial assignment of Dr. Whitmore. The room was so quiet that Adrian could hear the soft mechanical breath of the monitoring equipment and the distant sound of the corridor outside his door and nothing else. Elena didn't know, he said. It was not a question. Everything we have on her says no. She's clean, Adrian, but she was placed. Placed. The word had the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Elena Whitmore had not come into his life twice by coincidence. She had been put here. Chu's sister had moved the pieces from inside the hospital's administrative system, ensuring that when the physician reassignment came up, Elena's name landed on his chart, knowing he would recognize her, knowing the history between them, knowing that if anyone could get through the walls Adrian Valenti had spent 15 years building, it was her. They had used her as a key. They had turned her into something to be weaponized against him without her knowledge, without her consent, taking the one real thing from his past and making it into a tool for his destruction. He sat with that for a long time. "I need Chu brought in," he said finally. His voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that people who knew him had learned was far more dangerous than loud. "Quietly, tonight. Nothing happens to him until I'm there." "You're in a hospital bed." "Then you wait until I'm not." "Adrian, the Ferraro situation isn't going to... It will wait." He said it with a finality that ended the sentence. "Chu waits. Ferraro waits. Everyone waits. I will handle this when I can be present for it, because I am not going to manage this kind of problem through proxies from a hospital room." He paused. "One thing at a time." "What's the first thing?" Marcus said. Adrian looked at the door. "I need to tell Elena." He did not do it immediately. He spent the rest of the afternoon working through every possible approach and discarding each one in turn. The clinical version, where he presented the facts without context, felt like another form of management. The direct version felt like an ambush. He had spent 15 years learning how to have difficult conversations, and almost none of that training applied here because none of those conversations had been with someone whose well-being he actually cared about. He asked the night nurse to contact Elena and let her know he needed to speak with her before her shift ended. He said it was about his recovery program. He said it was not urgent. Both of those things were untrue. She came at 7:15, still in her hospital coat, her badge slightly crooked the way it always was by the end of a long day. She came in and stood by the door with her tablet, and he said, "Sit down." And something in his voice made her come to the chair beside the bed without argument. He told her. He told her the shape of it, not every detail, but enough. Daniel Chu, the sister in hospital administration, the physician assignment that had not been random, the surveillance communication with her name in it. He told her that she had been placed in his case deliberately by people who knew their history and wanted to use it against him. He told her she was not in immediate danger as far as his people could determine. He told her he was sorry. She sat through all of it without speaking. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Say something," he said. She looked at her hands in her lap. Her posture was very straight, the way it got when she was holding something in that required significant structural support. "How long have you known?" "Since last night." "You didn't say anything during the session this morning." "No." She was quiet again. Then she looked up. Her eyes were dark and very steady, and what was in them was not the thing he had been bracing for. Not fear, not anger, not the kind of emotional shattering that he would have understood. What was in them was something more complicated and, in some ways, harder to navigate. "You were testing me," she said. He started to answer, and she held up one hand, just slightly, just enough. "This morning," she said, "you already knew and you were watching me, to see what I would do." Not an accusation, just a statement of the fact, delivered with the clarity of someone who had just reorganized all of the morning's details into a pattern that now made sense. He did not deny it. "I needed more information before I said anything." "You needed to know if I was involved." "Yes." She looked at him. The steadiness of her gaze was the same quality he had noticed the first time she walked into this room, the quality he had initially categorized as professional composure and had since come to understand was something more fundamental than that. It was the specific and hard-won stability of a person who had been through genuinely bad things and had decided, somewhere in the middle of them, that falling apart was not an option she was willing to take. "I've been used as leverage before," she said. "Not like this, but I understand the shape of it." "Elena, I'm not angry at you for checking," she said. "I would have done the same thing." She looked at the window. "I'm angry that someone looked at our history and decided it was a tool." "So am I." She turned back to him. "What happens now?" He told her about the plan to bring Chu in. He told her about Ferraro, enough for her to understand the scale of what was in motion. He told her that his people would be maintaining close proximity to her outside the hospital until the situation was resolved, and he told her that she could not tell anyone at the hospital about any of this. She listened to all of it with the focused attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And your recovery?" He looked at her. "What about it?" "You said one thing at a time. Chew, Ferraro. What comes after that in your list?" He had not actually made a list. He had been operating on the immediate problem, which was what he always did when the situation required it. The recovery had been, not forgotten, but pushed to the periphery in the way that anything non-critical got pushed when genuine danger was present. "The recovery continues," he said, "with me." "Yes, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her face he could not fully read, which was unusual. Something that had to do with all of it. The history, the morning session, the information he had just given her, the entire accumulation of the past several weeks. And she was sorting through it with the same careful attention she brought to a complicated chart. "I'm willing," she said finally. She stood up. She straightened her badge. 8 o'clock tomorrow. She was at the door when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something changed in her face. Not the careful, controlled change of someone managing a reaction, but the involuntary change that happened when the body received information faster than the mind could organize it. Her color shifted. Her hand tightened on the phone. "Elena," he said. She looked up. Her eyes found his across the room, and in them was the specific quality of someone standing at the exact moment before everything changes. She answered the call. He watched her listen. He watched the color drain further from her face. He watched her left hand find the doorframe and grip it, not for balance exactly, but for the physical reality of something solid, something that was not moving. She lowered the phone. "That was my doctor," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that voices got when the alternative was something they could not afford. "In Portland." A pause, the kind that had weight. "My last routine blood work came back." He already knew what she was going to say. He knew it the way he knew things before they were confirmed, the way he had always known things. Not prescience, just the ability to read the shape of a moment before it finished arriving. "The leukemia is back," she said. The words landed in the room, and the room became a different room. And Adrian Valenti, who had survived assassination attempts and federal investigations, and the long-accumulated brutality of 15 years running an empire built on violence, felt something give way in his chest that he was not sure he had the architecture to repair. He did not say anything for a long time. Elena was still standing at the door with her hand on the frame and the phone at her side, and the particular stillness of someone who had just received information that had not yet fully arrived. The body knew before the mind caught up, and what the body was doing was holding very still, the way animals held still when they sensed something large moving in the dark nearby. Adrian watched her from the bed. He had spent 15 years in rooms where bad news arrived and had developed over that time a specific discipline around his own reactions. The ability to receive devastating information and continue functioning, to let the information land without letting it show, to process grief or rage or fear in the private architecture of himself while his face remained workable. It was the discipline that had kept him alive more than once. It was not working right now. "Come sit down," he said. She shook her head. Very small movement. "I'm all right." "Elena." She stopped. She looked at the wall beside the door for a moment, not at anything on it, just at the fixed surface of it, something that was not moving. Then she looked at him. "I've done this before," she said. "I know what it looks like. I know what it requires." She was speaking carefully, the way you spoke when you were building the sentences in real time and could not afford to let one of them collapse before it was finished. I know how to do this." "That's not what I asked," he said. "Come sit down." She came and sat in the chair beside the bed. She set her phone on the small table and put her hands in her lap and looked at them. Her hands were very steady. Adrian looked at them too and thought about everything those hands had done in the past 5 weeks. The precise, demanding, patient work of putting him back together, and felt the thing in his chest that had given way when she said the words, "Do something it had no clean name for." "What did the doctor say?" he said. She told him. The blood work had flagged several markers that were consistent with a relapse of her earlier diagnosis. The findings were early, which meant the options were still broad, which meant the prognosis was genuinely uncertain rather than definitively bad, which was the version of this news that was supposed to be the better version. She needed to get to Portland to see her specialist. She needed additional tests. She needed to begin thinking about treatment timelines. Adrian listened to all of it. "When can you go to Portland?" he said. "I have patients. When can you go?" She looked at him. "You're in the middle of a crisis with your organization." "That's not what I asked." "Adrian!" Her voice had the edge of someone pushing back against something they could feel pulling at them. "You have men watching my car right now. You have a traitor in your organization who's been feeding information to a rival. You can barely stand without Elena." He said her name the way he had said it in the consultation room, without distance, just the word. "Stop managing the situation and answer the question." She was quiet for a moment. "I could go Thursday." "Thursday," he said. "I'll arrange transport and someone to go with you." "I don't need—" "It's not negotiable." He said it quietly, without heat, which was somehow more final than if he had raised his voice. "You go Thursday. You take whoever Marcus assigns. You get the full picture from your doctor, and you call me the moment you have it." He paused. "That's what happens next." She looked at him for a long time. Whatever she was looking for in his face, she seemed to find some version of it, because some of the structural tension in her posture released slightly. Not all of it, barely any of it, but enough that he could see the person underneath it a little more clearly. "What happens with you?" she said. "I handle what needs to be handled." "The Chu situation?" "Yes." "You're going to need to be mobile for that." "I'm aware." She studied him. "You walked 11 steps unassisted yesterday." "I know. 14 today would be better." He looked at her. The corner of something moved at the edge of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "It's 9 o'clock at night." "I'm aware of the time." She stood up. She went to the corner where the parallel bars were set up for in-room work, a smaller version of the rehabilitation gym's setup, installed at his insistence 2 weeks into his stay. She turned and looked at him. 14 steps. Then I go home. Then Thursday, Portland. He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to the edge of the bed. He did 16. She recorded 14 in the chart and said nothing about the other 2, which he understood was her version of the same thing he had done in the consultation room, giving him something without calling it a gift. She left at 9:30. He did not sleep. He lay in the dark and organized what needed to be organized, running through the sequence of events and what each one required and in what order. Chu first. The information Chu had given Ferraro needed to be understood in full before Adrian could calibrate the response to Ferraro, because the response needed to be proportional to the actual damage and not to the estimated damage, and those 2 numbers might be different. Then Ferraro. Then the Lorne Street situation, which was going to require a conversation that was either the end of the Ferraro-Valenti arrangement or the beginning of a very different kind of one. And underneath all of that, Elena. He thought about her flying to Portland on Thursday. He thought about the specialist's office and the additional tests and the particular loneliness of sitting in a medical waiting room with something large and uncertain attached to your name. He thought about the fact that she had done exactly that, alone, at 18 years old, in a city she did not know, while he had been 1,500 miles away writing letters into silence. He was not going to let that happen again. He did not know yet what shape that promise would take. He only knew that it was the one fixed point in a landscape that was currently shifting under everything. By Wednesday morning, he was at 14 unassisted steps reliably and working toward 18. Elena ran the sessions with the same demanding precision she had maintained throughout. And if she was carrying the weight of Thursday and Portland and everything her blood work meant, she carried it without letting it touch the clinical work. Adrian watched her and learned something about her that he had been slowly learning for 5 weeks, but that crystallized in those sessions. She did not separate the difficult parts of herself. She integrated them. The sick woman and the skilled doctor and the girl who had written letters from a strange city at 17 were all present in the same body at the same time. and somehow that made her more capable rather than less. He did not know how to tell her that he found it extraordinary without it sounding like something she did not need from him right now. Marcus came Wednesday afternoon with news that Chu had been located and could be brought in that evening. Adrian told him to move. Carver, whose 2 broken ribs had healed to the point of functionality, if not comfort, drove the vehicle himself. 2 other men who had been with the organization for over a decade and whose loyalty Marcus had personally verified handled the rest. Daniel Chu was brought to a building in the West District that the Valenti organization used for conversations that required privacy. It was a warehouse space that had been used for storage until 2 years ago and still smelled faintly of industrial solvent and metal. There were chairs and a table and overhead lighting that was not kind to anyone sitting under it. Adrian was not there yet. He had arranged transport for 9 that evening. Marcus pushed back on this extensively, citing the medical situation, the logistics, the plain and fundamental fact that Adrian was still a rehabilitation patient who had walked 16 steps unassisted the previous night and was now proposing to go to a warehouse in the West District to conduct a high-stakes interrogation. Adrian listened to all of this and then said, 9 o'clock. And Marcus had the expression of a man who had learned, over 15 years, exactly where the argument ended. The transport was a modified vehicle with rear accessibility and enough space for the wheelchair, which Adrian hated with the specific and visceral hatred of a man who had spent his adult life moving through the world as a physical force and was now being moved through it in a piece of medical equipment. He said nothing about this. He sat in the back of the vehicle and watched the city go past the window and thought about Daniel Chu and organized himself. Chu was 31 years old. He had been recruited into the organization at 25 through a contact in the accounting sector, brought in initially to handle financial operations, and gradually given expanded responsibilities as he demonstrated competence and apparent reliability. He was quiet. He was methodical. He had never in 6 years triggered any of the flags that Marcus's people used to monitor the organization's internal health. He had been doing this for at least 8 months, based on what Marcus's people had traced. 8 months of sitting in meetings, 8 months of taking salary, 8 months of feeding information to Gianni Ferraro about the organization's vulnerabilities while presenting the face of a loyal operative. Adrian thought about the specific kind of patience that required and what it said about the people behind it. Chu was sitting at the table when Adrian was brought into the room. He looked up when the door opened, and when he saw who came through it, something happened in his face that was not quite fear, but was in that neighborhood. A fast recalibration, a reassessment of his position, the rapid internal calculation of someone who had just discovered that the situation they thought they were in was not the situation they were actually in. Adrian was moved to the position across the table. The 2 men who had brought Chu withdrew to the periphery of the room. Marcus stood to Adrian's left. The overhead light made everything look exactly as bleak as it was. Chu said nothing. Adrian said nothing for almost a full minute. He sat across from Chu and looked at him with the particular quality of attention that had been described by people who had sat across from it as the feeling of being read at a molecular level. It was not a performance. It was simply what happened when Adrian Valenti looked at someone he needed to understand. "How long has your sister worked in hospital administration?" he said finally. Chu blinked. It was small and fast, and he controlled it well, but Adrian had been watching for exactly that. 4 years, Chu said. "When did Ferraro approach you?" A pause. "I don't know what you... Daniel." Adrian's voice was very even. "I have the communication you sent from the spoofed staff account. I have the financial records showing 3 deposits into an account registered to a shell company that Ferraro's people set up 14 months ago. I have phone records placing you in the vicinity of the Lorne Street meeting location on the same day Ferraro met with the distributors." He paused. "I have enough. What I don't have yet is the full shape of what you gave him and what he promised you in return. That's what we're going to discuss." The room was quiet. Chu's jaw was tight. He was working through his options, which Adrian could see him doing. The same rapid internal assessment, the same recalibration. He was not a stupid man. That was part of what had made him useful and part of what had made him dangerous. "I want assurances," Chu said. "You're not in a position to negotiate assurances." "Then we're going to be here a long time." Adrian looked at him steadily. "We have time." They had time because Ferraro was not yet ready to move. The meeting with the Lorne Street distributors had been a relationship-building exercise, not a final commitment. Ferraro was still in the assessment phase, still building his picture of how incapacitated Adrian was and how long the window of opportunity would remain open. He had not yet committed to action, which meant Adrian had days rather than hours, but days rather than weeks. Chu understood this. He was smart enough to understand the game he was in. Ferraro said he'd give me the Eastern District operation, Chu said finally, once the transition was complete. The transition, Adrian said. The reorganization. Chu met his eyes. He wasn't planning a hostile takeover. He was planning a restructuring, absorbing the Valenti assets into the Ferraro operation and rebranding the whole thing. He paused. He needed to know you weren't going to recover. He needed to time it for when the organization was at its most vulnerable. And you provided that assessment. I provided information. I told him what the doctors were saying, what your recovery timeline looked like, that the people under you were starting to question whether you were coming back. Adrian sat with that. What else? Chu looked at the table. He asked about leverage, personal leverage, things that could be used to... If you recovered faster than expected, he wanted options, ways to keep you occupied, keep you from being able to respond effectively. The room was very still. He knew about Dr. Whitmore, Adrian said. Yes. How? I told him. Chu said it without flinching, which was either genuine absence of remorse or an excellent simulation of it. I found the connection when I was researching your file. The history between you, he thought she could be used. Adrian's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, which was its own kind of signal to the men in the room. He thought if he put her in your path and it went wrong, it would be a distraction. And if it went right, it would make you easier to manage, Chu said. Yes. The word management landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had been chosen deliberately. Ferraro looking at Adrian's one genuine vulnerability, the one person who had ever made him feel something real, and deciding it was a lever to pull. Adrian sat very still for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. Get Ferraro on the phone. Marcus raised his eyebrows very slightly. Now. Now. Adrian, if you tip him that we have Chu... Get him on the phone, Marcus. Ferraro answered on the third ring. His voice had the particular quality of a man who was used to calls at odd hours and had learned to answer them with a kind of pre-assembled calm. Adrian, he said, this is unexpected. I want to meet, Adrian said. Tomorrow, Meridian Club, noon. A pause. I wasn't aware you were... Noon, Gianni. He kept his voice level, almost conversational. I'll be there. Bring whoever you need to bring, but be there. Another pause, longer, the kind where the other person was recalculating. All right, Ferraro said. Noon. Adrian ended the call. Chu was looking at him from across the table. He'll know something's wrong. Yes, Adrian said. He will. Then why? Because I want him to know something's wrong. Adrian looked at Chu. I want him spending tonight trying to figure out what I know and how much of it I know and what I'm planning to do about it. I want him walking into that room tomorrow off balance. He paused. People make mistakes when they're off balance. Chu was quiet. Here is what happens to you, Adrian said. You cooperate fully with everything Marcus needs from you in the next 14 hours. Names, dates, the complete picture of what you gave Ferraro and when. Everything. He looked at Chu steadily. In exchange, you leave this city. Tonight. With enough money to start somewhere else, and the understanding that if you ever surface in any capacity connected to this organization or this city, the arrangement ends. Chu looked at him. That's it. That's it. You're not going to... I'm going to need the next 14 hours for something more important, Adrian said. Don't mistake efficiency for mercy. He was back at the hospital by 1 a.m. He could not sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about the meeting at noon and what it required and ran through the variables with the systematic attention of a man who had learned that the quality of his thinking in the hours before a critical confrontation determined the quality of the confrontation itself. He thought about Ferraro's voice on the phone and the pause before he agreed, which had been 3 seconds too long and had contained inside it the precise shape of a man reassessing a situation he thought he controlled. At 4 in the morning, his phone buzzed. Elena. He stared at the screen for a moment, then answered. "I woke you," she said. "No." A pause. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." The line was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that happened between people who had moved past the point of needing to fill silence with noise. "I keep thinking about Thursday," she said. "I know. The last time I went through treatment, I told myself it was a singular event, that it happened once, and it was done, and the rest of my life was going to be on the other side of it." She paused. "I built my entire career on that premise, the idea that I knew what it felt like to be on the patient side of rehabilitation, and I was going to use that." Another pause. "Now I'm back on the patient side, and I don't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You do what you just told me to do 3 hours ago." "What?" "One more step," he said. "That's what you tell me every session. Not all the steps, just one more." The line was quiet. "Thursday," she said finally. "Portland. 1 step." "Yes." Another silence. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, steady and slow, and he lay in the dark hospital room and listened to it and thought about how strange it was that this particular sound, in this particular silence, was the most grounded he had felt in weeks. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." A pause. "Adrian." "Yes." "Be careful tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. "Always." She ended the call. He lay in the dark for another hour, not sleeping, thinking about noon, about Ferraro walking into the Meridian Club and finding him there, present and upright and functional, in ways Ferraro had been assured would not be possible. About the look on Ferraro's face when he understood that the window he had been carefully constructing for months had closed. About what Adrian needed to say and how he needed to say it and whether he could hold the entire weight of it. The organization, the threat, Elena's illness, the meeting, the steps he still needed to learn to walk, without any of it giving way at the wrong moment. At 7 in the morning, Elena walked in for the session. She looked like someone who had slept badly and gotten up anyway, and made herself functional through sheer architectural willpower. She looked, in other words, exactly like him. She looked at him across the room. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything about the phone call. It was already inside the room with them, present in the particular quality of the air between them, but it did not need to be named. Some things were large enough that naming them would only make them smaller. 8 o'clock, she said. Yes, he said. She set down her tablet. She went to the parallel bars. She turned and looked at him with the expression he had learned to recognize over 5 weeks. The one that was not asking whether he was ready, but was telling him that ready was not actually a prerequisite. Today, she said, you're going to walk to the end of these bars and back, unassisted. He looked at the length of the bars, 18 feet, maybe 20. And then, she said, you're going to walk to the door. The room was quiet for a moment. Elena, you have a meeting at noon, she said. I don't know the details and I don't need to. But you need to walk into that room on your own 2 feet. She held his eyes. So that's what we're going to do this morning. He looked at her for a long time. Then he moved to the edge of the bed. The first pass of the bars took 4 minutes and cost him more than he was willing to show in his face. Every step a negotiation between his brain and his legs. A conversation conducted in a language his body was still relearning, sweat on his hands and his jaw locked, and the sound of his own breathing louder than anything else in the room. Elena walked beside him but did not touch the bars, did not touch him, kept her hands at her sides and her eyes on his feet, and said nothing until he reached the end. Back, she said. He went back. By the time he reached the door, 18 steps past the end of the bars, each one its own individual act of will, his shirt was soaked through, and his legs were shaking in a way he could feel in his teeth, and Elena was standing 3 feet behind him, and the door handle was in front of him, and he put his hand on it and stood there for a moment breathing. "Open it," she said. He opened the door. The corridor was ordinary and fluorescent lit and smelled like every hospital corridor in the world, and Adrian Valenti stood in the doorway of his room on his own two legs for the first time in 6 weeks and looked at it. "Good," Elena said quietly. He turned around. She was standing in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and her face doing something complicated that she was not entirely controlling, and he looked at her across the space between them and thought about everything that had brought them both to this exact moment. The accident, the letters, the years, the illness, Chu, Ferraro, Portland, Thursday, the phone call at 4 in the morning, and felt the full weight of all of it and stood under it without flinching. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "After the meeting today," he said. "After Portland. After however long the treatment takes and whatever it requires." He held her eyes across the room. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. Her jaw was very tight. "Adrian, I'm not asking you to respond to that right now," he said. "I'm just telling you, so you have it. So when you're in Portland and it gets hard, you have it." The room was quiet. She looked at him for a long time with the expression of a woman who had learned very early that the people who said they would stay were often the ones who left, and who was now standing in front of the one genuine exception to that pattern and did not entirely know what to do with it. Then she picked up her tablet. "The car comes at 11:30, she said. "Don't be late." She walked past him into the corridor, and Adrian stood in the doorway of his room on his own 2 feet and watched her go, and at 11:28 he walked out of that room without a wheelchair for the first time, down the corridor, through the lobby, and into the waiting car. At noon he walked into the Meridian Club. Gianni Ferraro was already at the table when Adrian came through the door, and Ferraro looked up and saw him standing there. Standing, walking, present and upright, and looking at him across the room with the particular quality of stillness that had no warmth in it whatsoever. And the color left Ferraro's face in a way that told Adrian everything he needed to know about how complete Ferraro's intelligence had been, and how badly this moment had just shattered it. Adrian crossed the room and sat down across from him. "Gianni," he said. Ferraro looked at him. His composure was good. He had held his position for 20 years, and that kind of longevity required very good composure. But underneath it, something was working very fast and not entirely successfully. "Adrian," he said, "you look well." "Better than expected," Adrian said. "I know." Ferraro was quiet. "Here is how this conversation goes," Adrian said. He set his hands flat on the table. He had not eaten since 6 in the morning, and his legs were still not entirely steady under the table, and there was a version of this that could go badly in ways that would cost him significantly. He had weighed all of that on the way here and decided the alternative cost more. "You tell me the full scope of what you were planning, the timeline, the people involved beyond Chu, the financial arrangements you'd made with the Lorne Street distributors." He looked at Ferraro steadily. "And I listen. And then we determine together whether there is any version of a continued arrangement between our organizations or whether this is the conversation that ends it." Ferraro looked at him. "And if I don't?" "Then everything I have goes to every family that has a reason to wonder whether Gianni Ferraro can be trusted," Adrian said. "Which, given the scope of what you were planning and how you were planning it, is a long list." The Meridian Club moved around them, ordinary and indifferent, the lunch crowd filling the space with noise and the smell of food, and the comfortable sounds of people who were not sitting across a table from the specific quality of problem that Adrian Valenti currently represented to Gianni Ferraro. Ferraro looked at the table. Then he looked up, and he began to talk. Gianni Ferraro talked for 41 minutes. Adrian sat across from him and listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, without changing his expression in any way that gave Ferraro information about what the information was doing to him. He had learned this discipline early, the ability to receive without reacting, and he used it now with the full weight of 15 years behind it. The scope of what Ferraro had been building was larger than Marcus had estimated. It was not simply the Lorne Street distributors. Over 14 months, Ferraro had quietly cultivated relationships with 3 of the Valenti organization's mid-tier operational contacts, not enough to constitute a takeover on their own, but enough to create the infrastructure of one, Enough that if the right moment arrived, if Adrian remained incapacitated long enough, if the organization's internal confidence eroded past a certain threshold, the transition could happen with the appearance of something organic rather than something engineered. Ferraro had been patient and methodical and had understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent 20 years in this world, that the most dangerous kind of move was the one that looked inevitable in retrospect. He had also, in the final months of the preparation, understood that Adrian's personal history with Elena Whitmore was the one variable he could not fully control. He had not intended for Elena to come to harm. He said this with the specific quality of a man who believed in the distinction between collateral damage and intent, and thought the distinction mattered. Adrian did not correct him on this. He filed it. When Ferraro finished, the table between them was quiet for a long time. "The Lorne Street contacts," Adrian said. "They don't know the full shape of what you were building." "No, they know I was expanding. They don't know at whose expense." "Then they stay where they are." Adrian looked at him steadily. "You tell them the expansion is on hold indefinitely. Personal reasons. You do not explain further." Ferraro looked at him. "And the arrangement between our organizations?" "Ends," Adrian said. "Effective today. Clean separation, no hostility. You stay in your districts, I stay in mine, and we have no further contact beyond what existing contracts require to wind down." He paused. "Those contracts finish on their natural terms. Nothing accelerated, nothing disrupted. When they're done, they're done. And the information you have?" "Stays where it is," Adrian said, "as long as the arrangement holds. If it doesn't hold, if I find you anywhere near my operations or my people or anyone connected to me, the arrangement changes." He looked at Ferraro with the same quality of stillness he had carried across the room when he walked in. "You understand what I mean by that?" Ferraro understood. He left 20 minutes later. Adrian sat at the table alone for a while, with the remains of a lunch neither of them had eaten, and the noise of the restaurant moving around him, and the particular quality of aftermath that settled into the body after something large had been resolved. Not peace, exactly, not yet, but the absence of the specific tension that had been running through him for days, like a current through a wire. Marcus appeared at the table. He had been at the bar for the past 40 minutes doing the thing he did in these situations, which was existing in the room without being part of the room, visible to Adrian and invisible to everyone else. "Well," Marcus said. "It's done," Adrian said. Marcus sat down. He looked at the untouched plates. "You should eat." "I know." "Elena's flight to Portland is at 4. Adrian looked at his watch. "I know that too." He ate. Marcus sat across from him and did not talk about the meeting because there was nothing left to say about it, and Marcus had worked with Adrian long enough to understand that the debriefing would happen later, in the organized and methodical way Adrian processed things that were finished. Right now the meeting was finished, and the next thing was Portland, and Marcus knew which one Adrian's attention was on. "How are the legs?" Marcus said, after a while. "Functional." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have." Adrian set down his fork. "They hurt. They're going to keep hurting for a while. Elena says that's expected." He paused. "I walked into this building on my own." Marcus looked at him. There was something in Marcus's face that he did not usually permit there, something that in another kind of man might have been called warmth. In Marcus, it came out as the particular quality of a person who had watched someone he respected go through something very hard and was quietly glad the hard part was contracting. "Yes, Marcus said. "You did." Adrian was at the airport by 3:15. Elena was at the gate with a single carry-on bag and her coat over her arm, and the expression of someone who had organized themselves very carefully before leaving the house, because the alternative was not organizing themselves, and that was not available. She looked up when he came through the terminal, and her eyes went to his legs, the way they always did, the clinical habit, still automatic, and then to his face, and something in her expression shifted in the way it sometimes shifted in the sessions, the thing underneath the professional surface moving. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." He walked with her to the gate. It was not effortless. His gait was not yet what it had been, And the airport floor was long and unforgiving, and by the time they reached the gate, his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was managing something he was not going to talk about. Elena walked beside him and did not offer her arm and did not slow her pace and did not say anything about any of it, which was exactly what he needed and which she seemed to understand without requiring it to be explained. They sat in the gate chairs side by side. "Ferraro," she said. "Not a question. Handled. Completely." "Yes." She nodded. She was looking at the gate window, at the aircraft on the tarmac going through its pre-flight preparations, people in orange vests moving around it with the purposeful indifference of people who did this every day and had long since stopped finding it remarkable. "When I get the full picture from the specialist," she said, "I'll call you." "I know. It might not be—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "The markers were early. That's a real thing, not just something people say. Early detection changes the numbers significantly." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You researched it." "Last night, after you called." She was quiet for a moment. "What else did you read?" "Enough," he said. "Relapse treatment protocols, survival rates by detection timing. The specific subtype you mentioned." He paused. "I wanted to understand what we were dealing with." She looked at him for a long time. The gate area moved around them, the ordinary airport noise, announcements and rolling luggage, and children and the compressed humanity of a departure terminal. And in the middle of all of it, Elena Whitmore looked at Adrian Valenti with the expression of someone who had spent a very long time operating on the assumption that certain things were not available to them and was currently in the process of revising that assumption. "We," she said. "Yes," he said. "We." She looked back at the window. Something in her posture had changed. Not loosened, exactly, but settled, the way a building settled when the foundation was properly reinforced. They sat in silence for a while. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of two people who had said the things that mattered and were now simply in the same space together, which was its own kind of language. Her flight was called. She stood up and put her coat over her arm and picked up her bag. She looked at him. "I'll call you," she said. "Yes," he said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in all the weeks since she had walked into his hospital room. She reached out and put her hand against the side of his face, briefly, just a moment, the palm of her hand against his jaw, and then she took it away and picked up her boarding pass and walked toward the gate. He watched her until she was through the door and gone. Then he sat back in the gate chair and breathed, slowly, in the noisy, ordinary terminal, and let the moment finish arriving. Portland took 11 days. Adrian was back at the hospital for his rehabilitation sessions. His physician had agreed to continue the program on an outpatient basis now that he was no longer immobile, which meant daily sessions in the rehabilitation gym that were brutal in the structured, productive way of things that were working. He had a different therapist while Elena was away, a quiet and technically proficient man named Dr. Park, who was good at his job and understood, without being told, that his patient was not interested in conversation beyond what the exercises required. Adrian worked. He worked the way he had worked at everything since he was 17 years old, with total attention and a refusal to acknowledge the possibility of failure. His gait was improving. The pain was still present, but had changed in character, become something he could work around rather than through, which his medical team described as significant progress, and which Adrian described to no one because he did not discuss his pain. Elena called every other day from Portland. The calls were not long, but they were consistent, and they had a particular quality. Direct, informational at the surface, something else underneath that neither of them named, but both of them understood was there. She told him what the specialist said. She told him what the tests showed. She told him what the treatment options were and what the recommended course was, and she spoke about all of it with the clean, unsparing language of a doctor describing a patient's situation, which he had come to understand was how she handled things that frightened her. The diagnosis was confirmed. Relapse, same subtype as the original, caught early enough that the specialist described the treatment pathway as aggressive but achievable. 6 months of chemotherapy followed by a bone marrow transplant if a suitable donor could be identified. The survival numbers at this stage and this detection point were genuinely good. Not certain, but genuinely good. "My father is being tested as a potential donor," she told him on the 7th day. Her voice was steady. "He's already said he wants to do it. He called me before I'd even finished explaining what the options were. Good, Adrian said. It might not be a match. Then we find another one. He paused. How is he? A silence. He cried, she said, when I told him. He sat on the other end of the phone and cried, and then he said he was going to fix it. Her voice had changed slightly. He's 70 years old, and he said he was going to fix it. Adrian did not say anything for a moment. That's what fathers are supposed to do, he said. And then because it was true and because she needed to hear it, he's right. She came back on the 11th day. He was in the rehabilitation gym when she came in. He did not hear the door. The gym had its own ambient noise, equipment, and effort, and the concentrated sound of bodies doing hard things. He was at the parallel bars, which he no longer used for support, but used as a measure, walking the length of them without touching and then turning and walking back, working the specific quality of his stride because the strength was largely there now, and what remained was the refinement, the trust between his mind and his legs that had been broken in the accident and was being rebuilt one session at a time. He turned at the end of the bars, and she was standing by the door. She was thinner than when she had left. The 11 days had taken something visible from her, the beginning of what the treatment would require, and she was standing there in her coat with her bag still on her shoulder as if she had come directly from the airport, which he later discovered was exactly what she had done. He walked toward her, not fast. His gait was not yet fast. But he walked toward her across the length of the rehabilitation gym on his own two legs without hesitation or assistance, and she stood and watched him come. And her face did the complicated thing it sometimes did when she was not managing it closely enough, the thing that was too large to be contained by any single expression. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. "You're walking," she said. "Yes," he said. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were very bright in a way that had nothing to do with clinical assessment. "Good," she said. Her voice came out slightly wrong, slightly not in her control, and she cleared her throat and straightened and almost recovered the professional composure and did not quite get all the way there. He reached out and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face. "I'm going to be sick for a while," she said. "I know." "The treatment is hard. It's going to be very hard, and I'm not going to be the version of myself that you've been dealing with." "I know." "You don't have to, Elena." He said her name the way he had always said it, just the word. "Stop." She stopped. "I have been watching you put yourself back together since you were 17 years old," he said. "Even when I didn't know that's what was happening. I watched you walk into my hospital room when your own test results were already coming back wrong and spend 5 weeks making me want to live in my own body again." He held her eyes. "I know who you are when it's hard. That's the version I've been paying attention to." She was very still. "Let me stay," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Let me stay." She looked at him for a long time. The rehabilitation gym was quiet around them, the equipment and the pale overhead light and the long windows with their view of the hospital courtyard where the poorly tended garden was doing its uneven best in the early autumn. Then she tightened her hand around his. "Okay," she said. The treatment began the following week. Adrian reorganized his life around it with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to anything that required his full attention. He retained his role in the organization, but delegated operational decision-making to Carver and a restructured leadership team, establishing a protocol where he was informed of critical developments and consulted on significant decisions, but was not required to be physically present for the daily machinery of things. He moved his primary residence closer to the hospital where Elena was receiving treatment. He was there in the mornings and evenings and on the long, difficult days when the chemotherapy was at its worst, and Elena lay in the hospital bed with the IV running and her face the color of old paper. He did not pretend it was not hard. He had never been the kind of man who performed comfort he did not feel. What he could do, what he found he was, in fact, equipped for in ways he had not previously understood about himself, was simply be present. To stay in the room when staying in the room was difficult. To sit beside the bed and say very little and not make her manage his feelings about what he was watching. She lost her hair in the 3rd week of treatment. He was there when it happened, the morning after the 2nd heavy chemotherapy cycle, when she woke and found what the treatment had taken. She was sitting in the chair by the window of her hospital room, and she was not crying. He had never seen her cry, not once in all of it, and he did not think it was performance, but rather that some people were built in a way where the grief went inward rather than out. But she was very still in the way she was still when she was holding something that required the full force of her architecture. He went to the bathroom. He found what he needed. He came back and pulled a chair in front of her and sat down. She looked at what was in his hand. "Adrian, you don't have to face something alone that you don't have to face alone," he said. "That's it. That's the whole reason." She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. He was not practiced at this, and it showed, but he was careful and unhurried, and when it was done, he set the clippers aside and sat back and looked at her. And she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a while. "You look terrible," she said finally. He ran a hand over his own head. "I know." Something moved across her face that was the first genuine smile he had seen from her in 3 weeks. Small and complicated and entirely real. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. "You don't thank me for this." Richard Whitmore arrived from Portland the following day. He was a tall man of 70, still straight-backed, with Elena's dark eyes and the particular quality of composed determination that Adrian recognized as the source of the same quality in his daughter. He arrived and took one look at Adrian's shaved head and his daughter's matching one, and his jaw worked briefly, and then he extended his hand to Adrian and said, "Thank you for being here." And Adrian shook it and said, "There's nowhere else I'd be." Richard was a donor match. The specialist called with the results on a Wednesday morning, and Elena sat on the edge of her hospital bed with the phone pressed to her ear and listened, and then lowered the phone and looked at the window, and her father, who was sitting in the chair beside her, reached over and took her hand without saying anything. She called Adrian. He answered in half a ring. "Tell me," he said. "He's a match," she said. The sound on the other end of the line was very brief and very controlled, and she heard it anyway. The exhale of someone who had been holding something for a very long time and had just been given permission to set it down. "Okay," he said. His voice was rough in a way it was not usually rough. "Okay. Good." Adrian. "Yes." "Thank you," she said. "For staying." He was quiet for a moment. "You're the one who told me," he said. One more step. The transplant was scheduled for 6 weeks out. The weeks between the confirmation and the procedure had a particular quality. Not calm, exactly, but the specific texture of waiting that came when the hard thing was inevitable and approaching, and all you could do was move toward it. Elena's treatment continued. Richard remained in the city, staying at a hotel 3 blocks from the hospital, arriving each morning with coffee for himself and herbal tea for Elena, sitting with her through the difficult afternoons, talking to her about the engineering projects he was still consulting on, with the particular quality of a father who understood that normal conversation was its own kind of medicine. Adrian came every evening. He and Richard had developed over the weeks the particular kind of relationship that formed between two people who loved the same person and were organized around that love without needing to discuss it. Richard asked Adrian about the organization once, early on, with the directness of a man who had decided he needed to understand what his daughter was involved in. Adrian answered honestly. Richard listened. Neither of them pretended the world Adrian came from was uncomplicated. "She's not fragile," Richard said at the end of that conversation. "She never has been. But she is." He stopped, looked at his hands. "She is the most important thing I have ever been part of." He looked at Adrian. "I need to know she's protected." "She is," Adrian said. "She will be." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the way men nodded when they had decided to trust something they could not fully verify but had chosen anyway. The day before the transplant, Elena was alone with Adrian in the evening. She was sitting up in the hospital bed with the window going dark outside and the room lit in the warm, low way it was lit in the evenings, and she looked different than she had looked even a month ago. Thinner, quieter, the illness having taken things from her that the recovery would have to return one at a time, but present in a way that was itself, that was entirely her, that no amount of chemotherapy had managed to diminish. I want to ask you something, she said. He was in the chair beside the bed. Ask. She looked at her hands on the blanket. When this is done, she said, when the transplant is finished and the recovery happens and I'm back, when everything is on the other side, she paused. What do you want from your life? What does it actually look like? He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. I want to stop running something that requires me to be a threat in order to function, he said. I have been building toward legitimate operations for 3 years. The infrastructure is almost there. It's not a clean transition. Nothing in this world is clean, but it's a real one. He looked at her. I want to finish that. I want the organization my father built to become something that doesn't require people like Daniel Chu to exist inside it. She was quiet for a moment. And outside of that, you, he said, simply. Whatever that looks like, I don't have a specific picture. I just know you're in it. She looked at him, her dark eyes in the low light of the room. I used to think, she said slowly, that I had already used up whatever luck I was going to get, that the first remission was the thing I'd been given, and I had to be careful with the rest of it. She paused. I built my whole career on that premise, like I was living on borrowed time, and the best thing I could do was make the time useful. And now, he said. She looked at the window. The city was doing what it always did, ongoing and indifferent and lit, and she watched it for a moment and then looked back at him. Now I think I was wrong, she said. About the borrowed time. She paused. I think it's just time. It's just the time you have, and you don't know how much of it there is, and the borrowing metaphor was always the wrong one. He looked at her. What's the right one? She thought about it. It's yours, she said finally. It's just yours. You don't owe it back to anyone. He reached over and took her hand on the blanket, the way he had taken it in the rehabilitation gym. And she looked down at their hands and then up at his face, and he said, Marry me. The room was very quiet. Adrian, not because of the treatment or the transplant or anything happening tomorrow, he said. I'm not asking because we're in a hospital and it's dramatic. I'm asking because I have been trying to find the right version of this question since I was 16 years old, and I have run out of reasons to keep waiting. He held her eyes. Marry me. After this. After the recovery and the rehab and however long it takes for everything to get to the other side. Marry me when you're well and we're both standing on our own 2 feet and there's no crisis to point to. Marry me then. She looked at him for a very long time. Outside, the city moved. Inside, Elena Whitmore, who had been sick and been well and been left and been found, and had spent the better part of her life learning to carry the things that were heavy without letting them show, looked at the man beside her and felt something give way in the interior of herself that she had not known was still held closed. Yes, she said. The transplant went well. The recovery was long and nonlinear, full of days that felt like progress, and days that undid some of the progress, and days that were simply survival, which was its own category and deserved its own respect. Adrian was there for all of them. He learned the rhythms of a hospital the way he had learned everything, through sustained and total attention. And he became, over those months, the kind of person that the nursing staff recognized by name, and the kind of presence that changed the character of a room without announcing itself. He continued his own rehabilitation alongside hers, the parallel work of 2 people rebuilding themselves at different speeds toward the same destination. By the time Elena's recovery was showing the first consistent signs of genuine progress, Adrian was walking without any visible indication of what the accident had cost him. His gait restored, his strength restored, his body having done the work it had been asked to do with the same stubbornness he brought to everything. They were married on a Saturday in early spring, not in the hospital, which was where Elena had initially said she would be willing to have it if the timing required it, and which Adrian had quietly determined was not going to be the setting because she deserved better than that. It was a small ceremony in the garden of a house he had acquired the previous autumn, a place with actual soil and actual sky and the kind of uncomplicated beauty that did not require explanation. Richard Whitmore walked his daughter through the garden with his hand over hers on his arm and his eyes very bright, and Carver stood beside Adrian with the expression of a man who was being carefully professional about the fact that he found the occasion moving, and Marcus stood at the back and watched everything with the quiet attention that was simply his nature. Elena wore a dress the color of winter light. She was still thin from the treatment. Her hair was coming back, short and dark and real. She was not yet the physical version of herself that she had been before the relapse, but she was present in the complete way that she had always been present, the illness having taken things from her body and left herself entirely intact. When she reached Adrian, she looked up at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then she said very quietly, only for him, "We made it." "Yes," he said, "we did." The ceremony was brief and entirely without ceremony in the hollow sense of the word. No performed emotion, no hollow phrases, just two people saying what was true in the presence of the people who mattered, under a sky that was doing nothing in particular and asking nothing in return. After, they sat in the garden as the afternoon went long, food and conversation and the ordinary pleasant noise of people who were glad to be together, and Adrian sat beside Elena with his hand in hers and watched the light change across the garden and thought about the specific and unlikely shape of everything it had taken to arrive here. The accident, the hospital room, her name on the chart, 7 letters that had gone into a void, and the void that had finally been explained, his father's specific and irreparable interference, the illness, both times, Chu and Ferraro and the long machinery of threat and response. All of it, the entire accumulation, and here he was on the other side of it, in a garden in early spring with the woman whose name he had been carrying for 15 years sitting beside him alive and his. He was not a man who counted things as worth the cost they had required. He was too pragmatic for that, understood too well that the calculation was false, that the pain was not the price of the good thing but simply the pain, separate and real, that had happened to exist alongside the path toward the good thing. But he thought that if he had been the kind of man who believed in arriving, in the idea that certain destinations existed and that reaching them meant something, this would have been it. Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The garden was quiet. Years moved through them the way years did, gradually and then suddenly, marked not by the large events but by the small ones that accumulated into a life. Elena returned to medicine and to rehabilitation specifically, working now with cancer patients in recovery, carrying into those sessions the specific authority of someone who had been on both sides of the process and understood from the inside what it required. She became known in the field for a directness that patients responded to, the refusal to soften what needed to be said, the insistence that difficulty was not a reason to stop. Adrian completed the transition of the Valenti organization over 3 years, a process that was not clean and was not simple, and that required the kind of sustained negotiation with complex realities that his father would not have recognized as strength. What remained at the end of it was a collection of legitimate businesses and real estate holdings and financial operations that employed 300 people and broke no laws and bore almost no resemblance to the thing Victor Valenti had built. Some people in the world he came from called this a loss. He did not. He walked every day. The accident had left nothing permanent in his legs, but he walked every day anyway, the way you maintained a thing that had once been taken from you and given back, with attention and without taking it for granted. He and Elena had 2 children, a daughter first, then a son, and they were raised in the house with the garden and the knowledge that their parents had found each other across an improbable distance and had decided to stay, which was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing. Richard Whitmore lived to see both grandchildren. He came for long visits and sat in the garden with the same straight-back composure and walked with his grandchildren through the untidy flower beds and told them about engineering with a patience he had always had for things that required precision and care. When he died, at 81, in his own home in Portland, Elena sat with it for a long time and then said to Adrian very quietly, "He fixed it. He said he would, and he did." And Adrian held her and said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. They grew old in the ordinary way that was not ordinary at all, through the accumulation of shared mornings and difficult seasons and the specific texture of two people who had decided that the other person's presence was not something they were willing to negotiate away. They argued sometimes. They were both too direct and too stubborn for the kind of relationship that never encountered friction, and the friction was real, and they worked through it with the same quality of attention they brought to everything. The refusal to pretend the difficult thing was not there, the insistence on resolution. Elena's cancer did not return. Not in 5 years, and not in 10, and not in the decades after that. And at a certain point, the absence became its own kind of presence. The shape of the thing that had not happened sitting alongside everything that had. On a winter evening, many decades after a Tuesday morning on the Meridian overpass, they sat together in the living room of the house with the garden, the fire going, and the evening coming down outside the windows. And Elena looked over at Adrian, and he looked at her, and she was old in the way that people were old when they had lived fully, the years in her face and her eyes exactly as they had always been. "We really did it," she said. He looked at her. "Did what?" She smiled. "All of it." He thought about the boy who had sat beside a girl at lunch, so she would not have to sit alone. He thought about 7 letters. He thought about a hospital room and a parallel bar and 16 steps and a beige consultation room and the shape of a woman's hand on the side of his face in an airport gate. He thought about a garden in early spring and the years that had accumulated in every direction from it. "Yes," he said. "We did." She reached over and took his hand. The fire moved in the grate. The world outside continued in the way that worlds continued without particular acknowledgement of what it contained. And inside the house with the garden, 2 people sat in the warmth they had built and said nothing further because nothing further was required. Adrian Valenti had been remembered, in the years when his name was still the kind of name that got remembered, as a man of considerable and particular power. The people who wrote about such things wrote about the Valenti organization and its transformation and the specific quality of his strategic intelligence and the way he had managed, in an industry that destroyed most of its participants, to survive and to exit on his own terms. They did not write about the girl. They did not know about the 7 letters, or the consultation room, or the parallel bars, or the shaved head, or the garden in early spring. They did not know about the Tuesday on the overpass, or what it had opened in him, or what it had eventually, after all the difficulty and cost and the long accumulation of everything required, led him back to. Elena knew. She had always known. She was the only record that mattered,